A very good morning to you. My name is Herman Pretorius, and I am Head of Strategic Communications for the Institute of Race Relations. Now, 2024 has been quite the year for South Africa, a bit of a rule-breaking year. We are, for the first time in essentially a century, in a situation where single-party dominance no longer defines the political possibilities in our country. The Government of National Unity, elected earlier this year, consisting of 10 parties led predominantly by the ANC, the DA, and the IFP as the senior partners in government, face a myriad of challenges in South Africa. However, IRR research has increasingly shown that South Africans are wise and informed about what has gone wrong in the country and what needs to go right. Fundamentally, it boils down to economic growth. That is why, over the last few months, the IRR has been publishing the Blueprint for Growth series, a series of papers setting out how economic growth could be achieved in South Africa. Today's is the sixth paper in this series, the second authored by Dr. Anthea Jeffery, our head of policy research, and it looks into the issue of job creation. Where to for South Africans who want to find jobs, who want their kids to find jobs? Because, as the data shows, this is really the pressing priority for our country. Anthea, I welcome you to this morning's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Mbali, if you could give Anthea the floor, we can go directly into her presentation.
Thank you very much, Herman, and many thanks to all the people who have joined this webinar to discuss these important issues. How can we generate millions more jobs, meet the ANC promise of jobs, jobs, jobs that has never been fulfilled? And how can we also achieve that skills revolution that's necessary for prosperity and growth? This is in a nutshell what I'm going to be covering this morning, that we now have reasons for hope. Herman's been pointing to why. But we're also in a situation of very low growth and high unemployment. And there's a desperation for jobs as a result, which means we need to bring down barriers to job creation, and that requires reforming labor laws. We also need to unleash the sectors that have traditionally employed large numbers of unskilled people. So we're going to talk briefly about agriculture, getting tourism going, expanding retail. But we must also generate better skills. This, of course, is vital for the country as a whole. With better skills, we can have higher productivity, more competitiveness, and attract more investment and have faster growth. At the individual level, too, people need better skills if they going to get into the jobs market, get that first job, and then climb the jobs ladder. So necessary reforms here, I think, are first of all to TVET colleges, and I'll explain all these acronyms in due course. We need to just scrap the setters and the other QCTO that I have listed there. We need to reform universities, and we need to make sure that we use all skills through a process of EED, as I'll also explain in due course. So let's start on the reasons for hope, and the picture tells the tale. It will soon be 100 days since the GNU was formed on the 3rd of July, 2024. And we have here 10 parties, all participating in the GNU, all agreed on the need for growth and jobs as the key priorities. Skills is often less in focus, but it's also crucial too. But what we have now is a better foundation through the GNU for tackling the reforms that are needed to achieve both jobs and skills. So let's look, though, at where we are at the moment in terms of growth and unemployment, and it's not a pretty picture. The growth rate in 2024 has so far been only 0.4% of GDP. That's not what we need. If we could raise the growth rate to 7% of GDP, then the economy would double in size every 10 years. That would be extraordinary. What we have now is the economy limping along, and we need much more growth to change that. We also have a very high unemployment rate. In June 2024, it stood at 33.5% on the official definition. That means counting only the people who are out of work but still actively looking for jobs. We have a very low unemployment rate compared to other countries in the BRIC alliance. If you look to the other original 4 countries with figures from 2023, Brazil had 7.7%, Russia 3%, India just over 7%, and China 5%. Figures far better than we have. South Africa's unemployment rate is also far higher than that in other African countries. Also in 2023, Ghana 3.9%, Kenya almost 5%, and Nigeria just over 4%. And because of South Africa's very high unemployment rate, we have a desperation for jobs. These are 3 examples. In 1999, 650 jobs advertised, 51,000 applications. In 2017, 1,500 jobs offered, 65,000 people applied. And last year in 2023, 8,000 jobs offered and 1.2 million people applied, which is a testament to the desperation for jobs, the extent of our extraordinary unemployment rate. So what can be done? We have to bring down the barriers to job creation, and that means we have to bring down the barriers to jobs in coercive labor laws that often deprive people of the choice to do anything other than what the government requires. I'd like to focus for a moment on the national minimum wage. That is now set at 27 Rand and 58 cents an hour. It's come up quite fast since 2019 when it was introduced at 20 Rand an hour. The current rate means basically 220 Rand a day, 4,400 a month. And you might think, but surely these are such low wages, people should be earning at least that. But the trouble is that we have unskilled and inexperienced people in the workforce, people who have left school without even a matric, people who have a poor matric but are still effectively illiterate and innumerate, people for whom business effectively incurs a loss, as Cyril Ramaphosa has said, if it employs them at these wages, and so chooses not to employ them, and the unskilled find themselves with a truly minimum wage of 0 Rand a month, rather than what they might have been willing to work for, which is less than an NMW. So what we need to do is to scrap the national minimum wage. It simply doesn't fit within our current unemployment crisis. Or we should reduce it to what the government pays on expanded public works programs. Jobs there are paid at 15, 16 an hour, but they're not really jobs, they're just temporary work opportunities, or 120 a day. And if the private sector could offer work at the same level as the government, there could be many more jobs created. In terms of reforming labour laws, we also need to look at the rules regarding dismissals. Under the Labour Relations Act of 1995, all dismissals are automatically deemed to be unfair unless the employer can show that the dismissal was for a good reason, a fair reason, and that it was carried out in terms of a fair procedure. So there's a reverse onus of proof that applies. The normal rule is that he or she who alleges, for example, my dismissal was unfair, must prove that. Now it's for the employer to prove a negative, that what he did was not unfair. And so this encourages many people who have been dismissed to go to the CCMA, which is the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, which is a statutory body created under the Labour Relations Act. And it handles close on 100,000 dismissals a year. The trouble is that the CCMA often comes to flawed decisions. Not so bad if it's conciliation or mediation, but if those processes fail, then the CCMA has the power to arbitrate or make binding decisions. And flawed CCMA decisions made by an arbitrator are not easy to set aside on judicial review. It's not enough to show that the decision was incorrect. The employer has to be able to show that no reasonable arbitrator could have made that decision on the evidence available, and that's a difficult thing to show. So employers are in a situation where they know that should they need to fire, say because somebody turns out to be unsuitable or might perhaps have exaggerated their CV and not have the experience that was expected, then firing is a very difficult and complex process which can tie the employer up for many months in front of the CCMA. So these labour laws, again, are unsuitable for our circumstances. And what we need to do is to go back to the common law rule when employment contracts could be terminated on the agreed notice periods contained in those agreements. That would give employers far more confidence to hire, and then the rules would no longer be a barrier to employment, but would help to bring more people into jobs. We also need to think about how we can boost the sectors of the economy that have traditionally, as I said, employed large numbers of unskilled people, and agriculture is one of them. And it's an important sector. It generates many valuable exports, which have been rising in value. It contributes 2.8% to GDP, and even more if you take in upstream and downstream activities into account. It employed 900,000 people in June 2024. It also faces many barriers, energy shortages. We've gone 6 months without Eskom load shedding, which is wonderful, but there are still concerns about the reliability of energy supply and about the rising cost of it as well. We have at the moment pretty dreadful logistics, roads which are breaking down for lack of maintenance, a rail network which has in many areas largely been crippled, ports which are among the most inefficient in the world, where fruit, for example, can pile up on the quayside, unable to get out to the wider world and the export markets for which it is destined. We have very high rates of crime throughout the country, and particularly in rural areas, where stock theft, for example, has become a major issue, to say nothing of farm attacks. We also have problems with water, not only the quantity of water, but also the quality of water, as sewage spills become more common. And we very much see the water distribution system breaking down. There's also an expropriation threat, which includes EWC, standing for expropriation without compensation, which is, of course, a particular worry. And this is supposed to be needed for land reform purposes, but the latest figures show that 19 million hectares of land have been transferred by the government since 1994, either to emergent black farmers or into the government's own control. So if we think that initially the goal was to transfer 30% of commercial farming land, we've achieved 25%, a little bit short of the goal, but not that short. The great trouble is that most of the land which is being transferred is now unproductive. Formerly thriving farms have largely fallen out of production, or they produce only at subsistence levels, which of course brings very little gain to the beneficiaries who are supposed to benefit from land reform. So we need fundamentally to rethink our goal here. The aim should not be simply to focus on how many hectares have we transferred, with little regard to how productive they remain afterwards, but rather how many commercial farmers of all races can we generate and see succeed, because that really is the great challenge. That is what would bring benefit to all concerned, including the many more people who could find jobs on farms. So we need to amend the Expropriation Bill of 2020, which provides for compensation without compensation, which has many other damaging features, which fortunately has not yet been signed into law, but it has been adopted by Parliament. However, President Cyril Ramaphosa has the right, in fact, the duty, to refer it back to Parliament for reconsideration, because it includes many provisions which are unconstitutional, and he has an unconstitutional obligation not to sign laws which fall within that category. If we turn now to tourism, we need to get this going. You can imagine, we can think back to how terrible a blow tourism suffered during the COVID-19 lockdown when so much of travel was stopped altogether. But the sector has been recovering since then, and in 2023 it had recovered not fully but substantially. It was making a contribution to GDP of 8.2% and employing 1.5 million people, and it has great potential for growth. The Minister, Patricia de Lille of the Good Party, has spoken of it being able to contribute 10.5% to GDP by 2030. But it too faces barriers. Some of them are the same. The energy shortage and the cost of electricity when it is available. The logistics problems, which for tourists, particularly wanting to travel by road, are serious. And especially our crime reputation. This is very off-putting to tourists from abroad, who are the people we most want to bring in and hear very scary stories of the crime levels in South Africa. We've also scored own goals by having very damaging visa rules, particularly for tourists from China. This is one of the most important external markets for tourism, and yet we have put in place rules that make it inordinately difficult for Chinese tourists to come here as a group, which is what most of them want to do. Australia, by contrast, recognized the importance of the Chinese market and then amended its tourism visa rules to make sure that travel to Australia was easy, and they benefited as a result. So we need many reforms. We've achieved some of them. We have, for example, according to Ms. de Lille, visa waivers in place now for 132 countries where people want to come here for short-term stays of less than 90 days. And many more reforms have been promised. We have a new energetic DA, Minister of Home Affairs, who's promising to digitize the department and bring it into the 21st century with a very efficient system backed by AI. We also need to expand retail. Great capacity to absorb the unskilled always has done. And we have something like 200,000 spaza shops employing 2.6 million people. These are informal shops, often set up originally by people in their homes, where small quantities of everyday items are sold. And it's a great service to township residents who just go around the corner to a spaza shop, rather than having to find their way to a shopping mall, which in the bad old days of apartheid was very far distant in the white CBD. We also have a vibrant Kazi economy, which has been tracked by Gigi Alcock. He is a fluent speaker of isiZulu, having grown up in Masinga, a poor area in KwaZulu-Natal. He's become very familiar with what is happening in the township economy right across the country, has written some books about it, and he talks, for example, of South Africa having some 50,000 Kazi kos outlets, fast food outlets effectively, which employ 200,000 people and turn over 90 billion a year. He talks about us having 500,000 hawkers or tabletop sellers who are turning over 120 billion a year. And he talks about a rental sector that turns over 45 billion rand a year. And this is people, many of them renting out backyard rooms in their homes to people in need of accommodation. Sometimes they're also renting out spas or shops to people wanting to operate that kind of business. And according to Gigi Alcock, we have an incredible plethora of informal businesses in many different spheres, turning over many billions a year, and possibly as much as 1 trillion a year overall. So how can we help this sector formalize and grow? Some ideas: we need to lighten the regulatory burden and make sure that what regulations we have are efficiently implemented. Red tape must work, as one economist said, and often we find ourselves in the worst situation with much too much red tape, and it doesn't work because implementation is so inefficient. We must reduce the tax burden. Many of these trades are taking place by means of cash. There's sure to be unpaid tax to the South African Revenue Service. We may need tax amnesties. We should put income tax where we do apply it at a relatively low level, particularly when people are getting started. We should also facilitate trade with vendors from Africa. In 2023, for example, we had more than 6 million people visiting South Africa from elsewhere on the continent, and many of them were people coming to buy goods here and take them back home to sell in countries to the north of the Limpopo. So there's already a vibrant trade there, but it could become still more vibrant and successful if we could solve problems like transport, increase the efficiency, bring down the costs, if we could smooth the process of people traversing borders. We also need to end the rent boycott that took off in the 1980s. This was a strategy that was used by the ANC as part of the struggle against apartheid. People living in townships were instructed or encouraged not to pay rent on their township homes. If they had electricity and water, not to pay for those services. And the habit of non-payment took off. When the ANC came into power in 1994, it launched the Masakane campaign, saying now it's time for us all to pay for the services that we receive from municipalities. But unfortunately, the habits of non-payment have remained. And now, in 2023-24, we find that municipalities across the country are owed a staggering amount of money. It's 347 billion that they are owed, primarily by households, partly by businesses, partly by other government departments, but mainly by households, many of which could pay, but are in the habit of not doing so. And the consequence is that there simply isn't enough money for maintenance. We have Eskom owed 80 billion rand by the municipalities, water boards owed large amounts as well. As a result, distribution and other services are breaking down, not being maintained. So if we want greater efficiency, we need to persuade people in the townships, including, one would imagine, many of these informal businesses using water and electricity without paying for it, to stop that and to start paying so that we can increase the quality of what is on offer and prevent the breakdowns. We also generate much better skills. This is a key need. The very sad thing is that many people leave school functionally illiterate and inebriate, and that includes many matriculants, people who are able to pass their national senior certificate at the specified pass rate, which is 35%, but who are, for all intents and purposes, still battling with basic literacy and numeracy, which in the view of many employers makes them virtually unemployable. We have essentially the same situation as in other countries. Our schools seem to be uniquely dysfunctional, but the underlying problems are the same. The public schools are free, but they're inefficient. And that's because the very large number of bureaucrats in the system, plus the teachers, are shielded by labor law, the kind of laws that we talked about before against dismissal. They're also shielded by quite often militant unions, such as SATU here in South Africa, and by funding rules, in terms of which tax revenue goes to schools every year without regard to how well or badly they have done. So they have no incentive to improve. How can we create such an incentive? We need schools, both public and private, to compete for the custom of parents, provided with tax-funded school vouchers. Equipped with those school vouchers, parents can choose what school they want their children to go to. And the vouchers that they bring with them will cover teacher salaries and school expenses, but those vouchers will always follow pupils to the schools of their choice, which means the schools really need to attract that custom and then keep that custom. And we explained this in considerable more detail with examples from around the world and another blueprint paper called Breaking the BEE Barrier to Growth. We also need to reform the TVET colleges. TVET stands for Technical Vocational Education and Training Colleges. And we aim to have 2.5 million students in the public TVETs by 2030. If we have a quick look at this pie chart, we can see that the numbers are far below that. At the moment, we have about 520,000 pupils in the public colleges and about 86,000 in the private, with a huge predominance for the public, which is very much because government money goes only to the public colleges. The throughput rates at these TVET colleges are dire. For example, in the second year of post-school training, the average of pupils that get through is only 32%. And moreover, we have very many bad TVET lecturers, people without adequate subject knowledge or pedagogical skills. We're using outdated curricula not suited to the needs of employers today. We provide little practical training, unlike the apprenticeship system which applied before. And so people, even those who graduate from TVET colleges, have skills for which there is very little demand. So what can we do to reform the TVET colleges? Here, it's useful to look back to the recommendations of the HERE Commission of Inquiry. This was established by President Jacob Zuma at the time of the Fees Must Fall protests, when demonstrations were taking place at many campuses across the country, often violent, costing in the end 800 million in damage. And Judge Arthur HERE was asked to come in and examine the funding of all tertiary education, both at universities and at TVET colleges. And he was very clear, I think quite correctly, that South Africa could not afford to provide free education for everyone, not with public debt so high and growth so low. But he thought it was vital that we should have free TVET colleges with all expenses covered, because we must have technical skills if we're to maintain the current complexity of our economy, which is already slipping. And in addition, it's those who have technical and vocational skills who will find that their skills are in high demand and can command good wages. But Zuma's plan for free education was very different. He announced it at the end of 2017, some months after the HERE Commission report came out. And he recommended that free education should apply to right across the board, to universities of technology, and also to the TVET colleges. So the TVET colleges are now largely free, but the TVET students get less than the university ones, which again signals that TVET training is somehow seen as less valuable than academic training, when very often the academic skills that are generated, really, there's no demand for them in the market, and they don't help people get ahead. If we just look at state funding for tuition in 2017, according to those bar graphs, we can see another problem too, that what the state promises to TVETs may not be delivered. This captures the situation as it was when HERE reported and before Zuma introduced his system. The state was supposed to cover 80% of TVET colleges' tuition fees, with students having to cover the remaining 20%. But very often they didn't provide the 80%. It was only 53%. And now again, it's the state that's supposed to provide 80%, and there's supposed to be a provision for students to obtain 20% from, in other ways, from the TVET colleges themselves. But one wonders, if there was so much slippage in the past, whether that slippage will happen again. The more serious problem too is that the overall costs of free education at the tertiary level for everyone with incomes below 350,000 Rand a year are just too high. It's unaffordable to the fiscus. But before we look at what to do about that, let's have a brief diversion to the SETA system. SETAs are sector education and training authorities, and we have 21 of them introduced in 1998. They are funded by employer levies. So once an employer has a payroll exceeding 500,000 Rand a year, he or she must pay a SETA levy, which is set at 1% of the payroll, and it goes into a fund primarily for the use by the SETAs. And the idea is the SETAs will approve training, the training will be provided, employers will then apply to the SETAs to get back the cost of the training that has been provided. But it's an extraordinarily bureaucratic process, with cadres appointed by the ANC having to be involved in almost all phases of it, and much of the training of a very poor quality. And this is whether the SETAs are providing the learnerships or apprenticeships that they are supposed to provide, or on-the-job training. There's little throughput. Very often the setters will take on quite a number of people, but very few of them will complete the course. And the courses, as I said, are of a poor quality and don't meet employer needs. So increasingly, we find that many businesses just don't bother. They pay the setter levy because they have to. They treat it as just another tax. They don't even try to jump through all the hoops in order to get setter approval for the training that they've provided. They just effectively write off that money. And it sits and piles up in setter coffers. Now, you'd think the government might say, something is wrong with this bureaucratic system. Perhaps we need a little bit more innovation or competition within it. Instead, they have effectively provided another layer of bureaucracy. And this is in the form of the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, which was established in 2010, which has now come fully into operation. It has taken over from the setters the task of approving training and training providers. And its big job is now also to make sure that the training is of the right standard, but because it's going to apply an external exam, which is rather grandly called the External Integrated Summative Assessment. And clearly that was chosen because it yields the acronym ESA. But bureaucracy on bureaucracy is not helping anything. And what we need to do is to just scrap the lot. We should give firms tax credits for training of their choice. And that would be far more appropriate and far more effective. We also need to reform universities. Student numbers have gone up from around 575,000 in 1995 to around 1 million in 2023, and they are expected to rise to 1.6 million in 2030. If you recall, the setter student population is supposed to rise to 2.5 million. So it's recognition by the government that technical and vocational training is more important. And yet, of course, the funding formula does not reflect that. The state subsidy to universities has always been too low. Universities are funded partly via fees, but also they depend on a subsidy provided directly by the state. Most countries provide a subsidy that's about 1% of GDP. Ours has been below that, and it's also failed to keep pace with the rising numbers. So what we find is that we have 5,000 new academic staff for 500,000 new students, and the universities are increasingly overcrowded and battling to cope. Throughput is 18% in general on average. Let me explain what I mean by that. If a student comes into university in 2022 wanting to do an undergraduate degree, which should be completed in 3 years, where 3 years is the regulation time, only 18% will succeed in getting that undergraduate degree within the regulation time of 3 years. And the situation is even worse in the STEM fields. It's 11% in maths, 14% in physics, and 15% in ICT. So there's a huge level of wastage in the system. How can we reform universities? The first is to raise the university entrance requirement. At the moment, you need a bachelor's pass, as the government calls it, but what is required is really set at a pretty low level. And the result is that the universities are being overwhelmed with people who are not prepared for the rigors of university study, who've come out of the school system thoroughly ill-equipped and then find themselves unable to cope with the pace and the intensity of university study and the level that is expected there. What we should do, I would recommend, is that we follow what the HERE Commission suggested, that students should get income contingent loans or ICLs from commercial banks, which they would get with the help of state guarantees. And this would replace the fee-free system, which currently applies for all students. The ICLs would be repaid over a period of, say, 20 years, when the former students' earnings are high enough, when they reach stipulated thresholds. And why HERE recommends this and other countries follow the same route is because university education is partly a private good. There's obviously a public benefit when more people have sound skills from universities and are able to contribute to the economy. But there's a private benefit to the graduates as well, who will find that their earning power is increased for the whole of their careers. And it seems fair, therefore, that they should pay for those degrees at a time when they are able to do so. I think we should also add a voucher element to boost competition and efficiency. So students funded by ICL vouchers would be able to go to either public or private universities and would have a choice as to which of the great range of universities they want to pick. This means because there's a choice, there would be competition. The universities have to compete for the custom of those ICL-funded students. We should also increase the state subsidies. As I said, these are lagging behind what most other people provide. He has suggested that they should be brought up to 1% of GDP and said they would be much easier for the government to afford because the state would no longer be paying for tuition fees and accommodation costs and all the rest. And so obviously it would be more affordable. In terms of how this should be structured, again, I think a voucher element is important, again, to give more impetus to competition and innovation. So the subsidies could be provided to students as tax-funded vouchers. So they'd have, as it were, two types of vouchers: the tax-funded voucher to cover the subsidy element and the ICL-funded voucher to cover the balance of their fees, accommodation costs, etc. Now, quick diversion to Deng Xiaoping. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And this is what the paramount leader of China said a number of years ago as China was embarking on reforms. Why is that relevant? Because we in South Africa have the unfortunate situation where we are not using all of our skills. We have a terrible skills shortage, and so we should use all the skills that we have, regardless of their racial identity. People in the Black community may fear that if we do this, then they will lose out, because the ANC has been telling them for decades that it's only because of the employment equity and other laws it's introduced that they get jobs at all in the workplace, which would otherwise turn its back against them. But that, of course, is not true, because Black skills have been in high demand since the early 1970s. In the 1960s, we had a decade of high growth at about 6% per annum. And at the end of that, it was clear to everyone, including the National Party government, that the white population was too small to meet the needs of the economy. And that realization prompted the National Party government, after decades of resisting any reform, to start improving Black education, because it wanted Black people to get better skills and to move into more senior jobs in the economy that so badly needed them. So the demand has always been there, and it's been increasing. What we need, of course, is to make sure that people do have better skills, and we also need to have rapid growth. The ANC conveys the impression that the jobs market is a sort of static pie, that it has to be divided between people on this side of the racial divide and people on the other side of the racial divide, and some will lose out in that. But of course, the jobs market is a pie that's constantly expanding, and the more growth we have, the more it will expand. And the more people have skills, the more they will find for themselves niches in that expanding pie. So the formula we need is rapid growth and better skills to boost demand even further. Whereas excluding skills on racial grounds harms the Black majority, again, that might need a little explanation. But if you think about a matriculant with a 38% pass, who's functionally illiterate and enumerate, is clearly not going to be eligible for a professional post or a managerial post, no matter what the law might say. What you'll find is those posts being left vacant if employers are forced to imply quotas and are afraid of getting the balance wrong. And that has happened in the state for many years now, and has vastly decreased the efficiency of the government, which has harmed the Black majority. The more it happens in the private sector too, as the government is now determined to secure, the more we will find that people are very aware of the skills shortage, very aware that they can't use some of the skills available, and will have less reason to invest here or try to expand here. So the Black majority, those millions who so badly need jobs, will be the ones who suffer. not the relative elite that are the few that do manage to benefit from these laws. So we argue that we need to provide real help to the disadvantaged by shifting from BEE, with its employment equity rules, to EED, which stands for Economic Empowerment for the Disadvantaged. This is a non-racial system. It applies a means test. It uses a very different scorecard where businesses are rewarded for everything they contribute to the economy, and people right at the grassroots are helped by the provision of things like tax-funded school vouchers, tax-funded health vouchers, tax-funded housing vouchers, which will immediately make a big difference to their lives in terms of better schooling, healthcare, and housing. It's a mechanism which reaches right down to the grassroots instead of confining its benefits to the relative elite as BEE does. So we need that too, so that we can have all the skills in the economy contributing to its growth. Thank you.
Fascinating. Anthea, thank you very, very much for that presentation. We are now going to spend the next 20 or so minutes doing questions, Q&A. I see some questions coming from the comment section. Thank you very much for sending those through. Over the course of the next 20 minutes, feel free to send in further comments and questions, and I will put them to Anthea. But let me start with this one. Throughout your paper and your presentation, you mention various structural reforms needed in South Africa. In a way, that prompts the question, what do you think the role of government should be in the economy compared to that of individuals and the private sector?
I think that we need an effective state, but one that has a more limited scope of operation, as it were. Small and efficient, I think, would be what we require. And that the main role of the government would be to set the fundamental rules of the game, and then to lift the heavy hand of the state off the universities, off the schools, off the TVET colleges, off the employers, so that the private sector can thrive. And then we will see much more of a focus on competition. Businesses of various kinds will be competing for the custom of people. That means they're going to try and be innovative. They're going to try and boost their efficiency and hold their costs down. And their customers are the ones who benefit from that. I think we've become accustomed to believing that the state needs to be involved in many spheres, which could in fact be left to the private sector to handle very effectively, knowing that individuals can be trusted to make good choices and that efficient operation will do much better than the kind of monopoly that state provision will generate over time, where bureaucrats have no interest in doing things differently, certainly not in innovation. They're not competing with anybody else, so they don't have that incentive to be more efficient. So in a nutshell, a small but limited state that does some of the key things, maintaining equality before the law, upholding the rule of law, making sure that we have an environment that attracts investment, that makes it possible for businesses to grow and expand, that in essence provides the revenue that we need for education and training, but steps out of actually providing the training itself, recognizing that you can have a range of public sector and private sector providers in that space, all competing for the custom of individuals who are empowered either with their own earnings or if they're poor, with the help of tax-funded vouchers. And then I believe that we would see innovation taking off and efficiency reaching a level which really at the moment I think we can only dream of.
You mentioned the rule of law, and something that the IRR has been very vocal about is this notion of property rights. And you mentioned that there's this legislation, the expropriation bill, on the president's desk. How do you think strengthening property rights could lead to better outcomes, particularly perhaps for South Africans who've been left behind by the decades of economic policy that we've seen over the last few years?
Right. Well, let me start perhaps with the very many people who do own houses. And one of the great, enormous injustices of the apartheid era is that Black people were barred from owning land in the common area, the so-called white area, and also from owning their own township houses, which for many years belonged to the municipality or the development board, until the 1980s when the National Party government implemented a big housing sale and started selling them at very low prices to township residents who'd lived in them before. And as a result of that, plus the efforts that have been made at expanding housing since 1994 by the ANC government, we're now in a situation where some 9.75 million Black households do own homes, but very often they don't have formal title to those homes, which means that they can't go to a bank and use their home as collateral for a loan, which they could use either to expand the house or perhaps set up a business. And there isn't enough of it. Yeah. And they're also afraid to use it as collateral because we still have such a housing shortage. If they had title to their homes, they would be able to do those things, start expanding them more with the help of bank loans, and also know that they are building up an asset which they can transfer in time to their children. This is really how the middle class grows, and that's been important in countries around the world which recognize private property rights. If you give the government the power to expropriate, to take that away, then you make yourself vulnerable to government officials deciding at some point that that's just what they will do. And private property rights are important also to the people who haven't yet had the opportunity to have their own homes, because so long as they are available, people can aspire to that as well. And if we can get the economy growing, we can get the skills pool up, increasingly people will have the jobs. And if under our EED voucher idea, they would also have the housing vouchers needed to give them the first step onto the housing ladder so that they could build up initially from a shack to a formal house and then expand the house and so on, and have a title deed to it with the security that offers, with the investment potential that that has, and the capacity to build up a nest egg to transfer to children. But it's also important from the point of view of political freedom. If the country is full of independent property owners intent on working in the private sector, building up their private homes, not being dependent on the government, then you have a level of autonomy which is really needed if political freedom is to be maintained. If by contrast you have the government owning all the houses, the government providing all the jobs, and all the healthcare and all the education and so on, people are heavily dependent on the state. And you will find, as in Venezuela to begin with, that it's those who are close to the ruling party who get the preferences, who get the benefit of these goods, and those who are seen by the government as hostile to it, opposition supporters, who are frozen out. So now your capacity to get a job or a house depends not on what you can earn in a free market, but on how close to the government you are. And that's not a situation that people want to end up in. You will find increasingly that political freedom is the other side of the coin of economic freedom. If you have economic freedom to earn independently, own independently, then you also have political freedom to vote for the government of your choice. The more you become dependent on a government, which will surely turn itself into a one-party government, the more you will find you have lost freedom of every kind.
Perhaps putting this idea of private property rights and the land question that's been simmering in politics for a century, a question from one of our attendees is as follows: does the 25% land transfer include land transferred to the old historical homelands such as the Transkei, the Ciskei, etc. With a comment here, driving through the Transkei area recently, the lack of any commercial farming was shocking. So that sort of the question of land, it has these property rights components of individual freedom, choice, agency, but it also has this larger sort of socio-economic implications of, can our agricultural sector make use of the fertile land that we have in places like the Eastern Cape?
Let me clarify first of all about the 25%. I was talking about 25% of commercial farmland. When the ANC came to power in 1994, the goal was to transfer 30% of commercial farmland to emergent black farmers. So it doesn't include the 13% that was effectively left in the hands, as it were, of traditional leadership via the 1913 Land Act and then the 1936 Land Act. That land has always been left out of the land redistribution figures. And that 13%, which became part of the homeland areas, includes some of the most fertile land in the country, because that was where black families had chosen to settle, because the rainfall was good, the climate was friendlier, as it were, and it was possible to grow a range of crops, particularly from the kind of tropical fruits that will grow in the north down to what thrives along the Eastern Cape. And unfortunately, it's absolutely correct that many of that land is now being underutilized. I think what has happened is that as the social grants have been rolled out, even though it's a small amount of money, and as the country is urbanized, you have many people going into the cities. We're now about 67% urbanized. They're earning something in the cities, whether formally or informally, able to send remittances back to their grandparents or other relatives living still in the homeland areas. So it becomes now possible for people to meet their needs for food by going to the shop and buying, and there's less incentive to grow. And so some of the best land in the country is really very underutilized. It's complicated too by the fact that ownership is communal. People will have plots which have been allocated for them for the growing of crops and so on, but there'll also be areas where cattle are grazed communally, and or goats are grazed communally, and so on. And there you have the tragedy of the commons, where everybody has the incentive to take as much as possible for their particular animals and no particular incentive to build up the asset for others. Whereas if it had private ownership, then each private ownership would want to make sure that that private piece of land is yielding to maximum effect, and would be able to stop others from sending their cattle and goats over onto it. But it's a very complicated issue because it cuts across customary beliefs, which have been deeply entrenched. I think there's also a concern that if you did move that to private ownership, you would find big wealthy people moving in, and perhaps quite rapidly persuading very poor people that they should sell for rather meager amounts of money, and then poor people will be left with nothing. I think that's a nettle which needs a lot more thought, which may and need to be grasped if we are truly to be able to benefit from that fertile land, and if we are to have an economy which thrives in every part of the country, and where people with appropriate good skills are able to move into jobs and see their prosperity rising without trying to, what some of them do now, scratch a living from the land.
Then this question of skills development and education specifically, there are unfortunately too many questions in the comments for me to get to all of them, but I do keep an eye on the questions as they come through, and I do try to collate them as best I can. On the skills development issue, you suggest tax-funded vouchers for TVET in private schools as a means to improve educational outcomes. How confident can we be that this introduction of competition can be beneficial in the education system?
Because I think we have evidence of it already, thanks to James Tooley. This is a man who is now the principal of a university in the UK, but he became, I think, very well known around the world in educational circles because he visited 22 countries and 4 continents to see how schools were functioning. And he found, to his surprise, even in remote parts of communist China, that there were private, low-cost schools in place. That the problems that I talked about, the state schools might be free, but they're inefficient, and the bureaucrats expand more than the teachers. The bureaucrats and the teachers are very comfortable not doing very much at all, and so the system just limps along. And people were therefore voting with their children's feet, taking them out of the free but failing state schools and then sending them to low-cost private schools, many of them set up in shack areas, in slums, and areas where the poorest people live. And those private schools were doing better than the public schools. The parents made that choice because they learned that the private schools got better results. They had better academic results. They had better discipline. They imparted better values. And people felt that the children were better served by the private schools than the public ones. And academic studies into quality have confirmed that. So it's not the perception of people who've been duped, it's in the figures as well. So there is evidence that if you have private schools, they will function more efficiently than public ones. And you can see the reason why. Because the school has to keep going. It has to attract parents who think it offers enough value for them to keep their children in that school, because another private school could spring up nearby and the parents will move to that school if it does better. So the competition means that the schools are constantly trying to improve their performance. It's also very true that the proprietors, have the power to hire and fire teachers. So teachers know that they don't have job security no matter how badly they do. They also have a reason to do well, so that the pupils in their classes will stay in those schools and their jobs will be secure. So the essence of private provision, there isn't a state guarantee of payment no matter whether you do your job or not. You have to compete for the custom of people who are able to compare your product with the product of somebody else. That's how the private market functions, and it's why it's so efficient and so innovative. People will be looking to new and better ways to do things. And if it applies at the school level, as we know it does from Tooley's work, I see no reason why it wouldn't apply at the TVET level too. I think that what the TVETs are relying on at the moment, why they have such bigger pupil numbers, is the fact that poor people can get state support to go to them, not because they get a good education there, but because the state will help pay for it. So if it was fee-free and you had a competition between public and private TVETs, then the public ones would start having to up their game, and the private ones would be there offering people the choice. Maybe it's better to go to a private one. And the private ones can spring up quite quickly in response to market demand. And then all of them will have to be up on their toes doing the best they can to keep the TVET students they have attracted.
I see a comment on this question, on this issue. Won't there be fighting at the school gates over limited places in good schools? But if I understand them correctly, no, because the more students and parents you attract because you're a good school, the more funding you receive, the quicker you can build new classrooms, the quicker you can expand your schooling capacity. Is that what's at the basis of this, is making sure that resources go where they perform well, where there's truly a good return on investment with parents and their kids?
Well, again, I think it's more than that. Certainly, a good school will be able to expand. But what you will also have is the market mechanism working. So once entrepreneurs are aware that there are families with education vouchers, that there's not enough school places for the people who would like to go to a private school, they'll be very quick, as they have been in these 22 countries that James Tooley has visited, to start expanding the private schools. So you won't get to a situation where there's a huge pool of unmet need. you'll get to a situation where more and more entrepreneurs are coming into this market and putting up schools and attracting the custom of pupils and their families. And in a way, it's what we have with the supermarket system. You don't have people fighting at the door of the supermarket to buy the loaf of bread, because the private sector is pretty good at anticipating the need and being able to meet it. It's only the thought occurs to me when the government intervened with the COVID lockdown, for example, that there was such a panic about this system that works so well with a whole lot of private providers competing with one another is going to break down.
I want to ask you a final question, then I am already stretching our time availability here, but I really want to get to BEE and EED. What are the main reasons that EED would be more effective in empowering disadvantaged individuals without enriching the few at the top? How can these policies really promise to look after those in the most dire socioeconomic circumstances?
Right. Well, let me start with the two aspects to the EED system as I see it. And the one would be a very different scorecard for firms. At the moment, we have a BEE scorecard where people get points for selling off 25%, 30% of equity to Black people, or they get points for employing, having 60% of their managers, their senior managers must be Black. Now, just think for a moment, as I was saying, the position of a person who's come out of matric, having got a 38% pass, who's really not good at either reading or writing or arithmetic because it's never been properly taught. We know that 81% of pupils in grade 4 can't read for meaning in any language. And that problem at the grade 4 level just keeps moving forward at the school level until you get matriculants who really haven't been equipped for the job market. Those people are never going to get what BEE offers. It's simply impossible for somebody with such low skills to get a professional job, which may require some kind of degree, or to get a senior management post, which requires extensive knowledge of a business and great years and years of experience. So those plum jobs are going to go to the relative elite, and increasingly they're going to go to the cadres who are close to the government. And if there are not enough people within those ranks to fill them, then posts are going to be left vacant, as has happened up and down the public services, we know. And the result then is partly because of inefficiency with the vacant posts, partly because people have been put into positions too early before they gained the experience over many years. You have a falling off in efficiency. So now the state is less able to function well, and the people who depend on the state for everything, including water coming out of their taps, are badly served by the state. At the same time, you have similar dynamic in the private sector, where it's even worse, in the sense that the private sector doesn't get money from the government every year in the budget to keep it going, irrespective of how well or badly it's doing. So private sector now has to meet unrealistic racial targets. With BEE, they have to bring in partners of a particular color who may not have experience, who may not have money. In terms of employment equity side of it, they have to appoint people to senior posts, to professional posts, again, who may not have the best skills, who may lack the experience, or they may decide they'll just leave the post open because it's just too damaging when you're not being bailed out by the government with tax revenue every year to bring in people without the experience to do a proper job. So you get the private sector not investing, and you get very low growth. The private sector knows that it's just so complicated to expand in this environment that they rather don't. And so it's a major contributing factor to our huge unemployment problem, which mostly afflicts poor Black people with poor skills the most. Give them a different scorecard, give them points, give them credit every time they invest. If they make any kind of direct investment in South Africa, they bring in new machinery, or they set up a factory, they get points for that. They employ people, they get points for all the people that they keep in their employment if it's an existing business, even more points for all the more people they bring in. They get points for all the taxes they pay, which are used for the as I see it, for the vouchers, or for other needs of the government, including the social grants. They get points for the money that they put into research and development. They get points for the goods they're able to export, which helps to bring foreign exchange into the country and grow the size of the economy. All of these are absolutely vital to growth. If business has that kind of scorecard, they have an incentive to expand. It's not a barrier to expansion. It's something which rewards their expansion. It's part of getting the economy growing, and so having many more skills, many more jobs on offer. That, to begin with, helps poor Black people desperate for work. Then the other part of EED is the vouchers. We need to reach right down to the grassroots. The current rules bring no benefits to the people who are living at the margins of society. But if they were given tax-funded vouchers for schooling and for housing and for healthcare, they would immediately have positive practical benefits available to them. Armed with a schooling voucher, they can choose what school their child wants to go to, and schools will be competing for their custom. It's hard to imagine anything more empowering. Instead of being dependent on a state which doesn't seem particularly interested in how badly the school is doing, you now have a school that wants your custom and is trying to do as good a job as possible to keep that custom. In the context of healthcare, instead of having to go to the overburdened state clinics, where we've had horrible stories about the level of hygiene, the fact that many of the medicines are stolen and aren't available, that people are put into jobs for which they don't have the experience. So accountability and efficiency begins to break down. They can go to a private GP, and they can afford to pay the private GP because they will, for example, use their tax-funded healthcare to take out medical scheme membership. This requires more reform. The medical schemes must be allowed to provide the low-cost medical scheme coverage that they've been wanting to provide for a long time. Cover that would cost something like 180 Rand a month per person in a family, and would entitle people to, say, 4 GP visits per member a year, and to go to a dentist for basic dentistry, and to go to an optometrist for basic optometry, a pair of glasses. And many of the needs that people have for medicines and treatment would be met through these low-cost medical schemes in the private sector, with the costs paid for by the private medical aid they can afford thanks to their tax-funded health voucher. Again, it's a very practical benefit which helps people at the grassroots feel that some of their needs are being taken care of and they are better equipped to thrive in this growing economy. And a similar principle with housing. You get a tax-funded housing voucher, you're living in a shack, you can start upgrading their shack. The Urban Foundation many years ago had all sorts of good ideas about the kind of materials that can be used, about the kind of advice and help that can be provided to people to help them build the best possible house. You will find that up and down the country, people see that there's now a greater demand for housing, and more backyard rooms will be erected, more flats will be erected, there'll be a choice of housing, and much of it will be affordable to people at the bottom end of the scale, rather than all the BEE benefits going to those at the top end of the scale.
I think I do need to bring it to a close. I see a comment saying that I'm asking my own questions and not those of the delegates. I do apologize. There are several sources of questions coming in that I just need to manage. It's not all just here in the comments section. But perhaps I could be as selfish as to take the last question and answer it myself, which comes from the comment section here. How much does the government listen to the IRR? If I may, it very much depends on you who are watching this webinar today, the thousands of friends of the IRR who've joined us over the years, people who read our publications, share our content, follow us on YouTube, on Facebook, on X, on LinkedIn, read our work published in the Daily Friend, make sure that we get these bits of research out there, including the Blueprint for Growth papers that have been plotting away for these ideas to make a real difference and upgrade the whole of South Africa into a growth posture. So the answer is it really depends on how much support we can get. And the more support we get, the more purchase we have with those in power, the more research we can do, the more polling we can do, the more case studies we can make sure we put out there. And we do engage with those in power on a regular basis and through various channels. But if we want South Africa to really become the home of freedom and prosperity that we know it can be, it is up to the people of South Africa to join us in building this pro-growth coalition with the ideas that Anthea have set out here this morning. Anthea, I want to thank you for your time, for this excellent research, for being patient with my stretching of the availability of these extra 11 minutes. And of course, I want to thank everyone at home, on your device, at work, at lunch, wherever you are watching this. We are optimistic about South Africa if we can get growth going, because it really is a country filled with reasons for hope, and we can press that advantage, and we can make sure that SA can reach its potential and become what it can and should be. I thank you very much. Until next time, all the best.
Thank you, Herman, and thank you.